Hello and welcome to Literary as Feck. And it's me, Clive Davis, and it's him,
Nicolas O'Shea.
And we're talking books as we usually do. And we take it in turns. This episode is my turn, and I chose YUKIO Mishima's book, Spring Snow, which is apparently the first in his what's it called?
Quadrilogy, I believe, is the correct term, Clive. Quadrilogy.
Right. Quartet, the Sea of Fertility, or tetralogy, even. Tetralogy, right? Is yeah. There's four of them, basically.
Yes, there's four.
Just in case there's anyone who didn't figure that out.
Four. This would be the first one.
Yes, number one.
And evidently widely considered to be the best.
Is that right?
At least in the reading that I did, yeah.
Okay, I have you read any of the other three?
No, I have not. So that's based on nothing other than hearsay and speculation.
That's the way we like it. I will be going on to read the other three, I think, though, because so I've read a couple of Mishima books now, a couple of his novels, and a collection of his short stories, and they're all great. I also did read, though, I think it's called Sun and Steel, which is it like a book of essays and
it's an Iron Maiden song.
Oh, okay.
I believe. Right. Yes. And I do believe that the song is possibly in some way tangentially connected to the Mishima. Right.
And that one was a lot more hard to get along with. And I suppose we'll get to this a little bit along the way when we talk wider Mishima context. It seems to me that his obsessions and themes and things that he's fascinated with, and his overall philosophy and outlook and all that, really speaks to me through his fiction. Like all the fiction that I've read, it's all there, but it's in a way that I can digest and that I can understand and that I find endlessly fascinating. The more I read of him, the more I realize, I'm probably going to end up reading everything that I can by this guy.
Right.
But then when it comes to the kind of direct, essay or philosophies or something like that, when it's essentially writing nonfiction, right straight over my head. It's the strangest thing. And I would point as a good example to this, there is a documentary, and it's on Netflix. I can't remember exactly what it's called. It's called something like Mishima's last, what was it called? Mishima's last, not conference. It's something like, so anyway, type in Mishima, you're not going to come up with that many things on Netflix, right? And it's a documentary quite recent documentary, and it was about, at some point, I guess in the late 60s, he gave a presentation to a hall full of basically student protesters, like the left-wing protesters who were raging against Ampo and all that stuff. And obviously they considered him at that point of the old guard, right? Like very much kind of
neo-fascist, basically.
He was, but
I don't think he made any bones about it. I think he was very clearly a neo-fascist.
But also so much more complicated than that as well, right?
I agree. That's boiling him down to only one of a bunch of things.
Exactly.
Which we'll get to.
Yeah. So anyway,
he's a difficult person to unpack, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, so they have this sit down where it's him addressing criticisms from this hall full of young radicals, and I was really psyched to watch this. I thought this is going to be fascinating. And it's amazing. Throughout the entire film, I had no idea what anyone was talking about. And And my wife watched it. My wife watched it as well, right? So this wasn't just a language barrier thing. I was watching it with English subtitles. She was watching it in Japanese. And after it finished, she was like, "What the fuck was all that about?" Like, we both, like, we heard what they said. We understood each, the individual words. We understood.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if they were just going or speaking a language that didn't exist.
Yeah.
It was recognizable as, they were saying things that were legible. But I was totally like, what is this debate about? I couldn't understand what this debate. It might be called Mishima's Last Debate, maybe. Have you seen this documentary?
No. But two things spring to mind. One is my experience of attempting to read in art school Baudrillard. And having that exact experience, reading to the end of a sentence and understanding what the words in that sentence meant individually, but having no idea what they meant strung together in that particular order, and then getting to the end of each paragraph and having the same experience. So I understood each sentence. Well, I didn't understand each sentence, which was part of the problem, but like it was mind-bendingly tiring and ultimately confusing and frustrating.
But somehow when it comes to his fiction, I don't find that a problem at all. So it's kind of an odd one. I'm not quite sure how this because especially when you're watching this documentary, I think it is called Mishima's Last Debate. Clearly both sides know what the other is talking about,
right?
Because they're engaging with each other, and there's lots of like laughter and it's not as if they're referencing things that I haven't. It's not that, like, when that happens, you're aware it's happening. I don't know what they're talking about. It's not that. It's just, I don't know, they seem to be speaking almost in a kind of coded language or something, and it's not landing at all. It was the most peculiar thing. And when I tried to read Sun and Steel, I didn't get on with Sun and Steel. I might try it again after I've read everything else, but yeah, when it's that direct, when he's directly trying to tell you something, he kind of loses me somewhere.
Which is hilarious, because then you're saying when he writes a novel, which is couched in so many ways in metaphor and in imagery.
Yeah,
but I agree, it's absolutely crystal clear.
Yes.
That really took me aback, because I don't think I've read any. My experience with Mishima comes almost exclusively through the myth. And the myth is, I read a pretty good essay actually just last night about this. The myth is something that he clearly cultivated, and his final act on the face of this earth was to absolutely kind of reinscribe and reify that myth, right? There's no question that his way of leaving the world was so that everyone would go back and read the books again and be like, oh, right,
right.
I can, you could see the through line in some ways, right back to his childhood when you read when you read about him, at all. But
for those who don't know, we should explain.
Sure.
He took his own life in the act of seppuku or harakiri, and had a second then cut his head off after he slit his belly open, after a spectacularly failed attempt at a coup, basically, right? At the self-defense force headquarters. He went there and he was like, yes, let's rise up and kind of take the country back in that peculiar Mishima's own very specific, like you mentioned, a sort of neo-fascism, but also at the same time a kind of weird hybrid progressive form of neo-fascism that didn't correlate to any of the people he looked up to in history.
No, and was highly romantic. There's no question that it's an incredibly romantic version of in a way feudalism as well, right? Looking back, I mean, he wanted to put the emperor, to give the emperor back absolute power. Yes,
and the self-defense forces basically just mocked and laughed at him, and it didn't go particularly well at all. Interestingly, there's for one kind of interesting take on it, there's a gay pink film from 1983, I think. You can find it with English subtitles, called Beautiful Mystery. And it's basically a thinly veiled version of Mishima and his followers. But of course, they're all just, butt fucking each other the whole time. And the end.
So they're making the subtext text then.
Yes, and the end is very much a kind of lampoon, not specifically of the Mishima character, but when he was talking, it's very much lampooning this kind of concept of dying for your beliefs. It's an interesting little film, actually, and also deals with that. Of course, that other side, another layer, was the fact that he was
at least bisexual.
Wait, yeah, but also closeted, but also in plain sight at the same time.
Oh yeah, because he wrote openly and consistently about characters who were gay, and obviously characters that were thinly veiled, autobiographical sketches.
And it's still unclear to me whether he thought it was almost beneath him to have to explain it. It was like, well, why do you care? This is, or that he was protecting his reputation. It's kind of difficult to judge, right? Which of those?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to parse Mishima's life at all. I mean, as I said, when I was reading through, in some ways you go back to like him at age. Well, he attempted to join the army supposedly, but at the same point, some biographers argue that he deliberately threw his, like when he went for the interview or whatever, and the medical checkup, right? Because he failed his medical checkup to join the army. It was written down that he had tuberculosis, which he didn't have. But there's this obsession then later on in life with physical fitness, right? Because that becomes a big thing for him, right? And kind of martial training, the rest of it. But that he says that he had wanted very much to be one of the Emperor's suicide squad, like either a kamikaze pilot or one of the frogmen, who blew themselves up, right? And so this idea with, I guess, death in the service of some great ideal, like, seems to go right back to the beginning with him.
Yes, and yeah, I agree with you. It seems as if the final kind of, when he did manage to pull it off, it's yes, he'd clearly done it over and over again in his mind and in his writing, and almost.
And 1 year before he did it it in a movie. In the movie Hitokiri, directed by Hideo Gosha Hideo. He literally, the final act of the movie is Mishima in full period, garb, cutting open his stomach, and
he made that short film based on his short story Patriotism, YUKIO,
which is again
which is
same.
Yeah, so it was clearly something where for him, I suppose, and I can kind of see this in a weird way, and I don't know what that says about me, but I suppose there is something about it, like if you can do that, that is real.
Fair play to you, lad.
Yeah, but that is real mind over matter, isn't it? That's like
right. But then
in a way, it's like you can't argue with that. It's like, well, no, I couldn't do that. I'm pretty sure I couldn't do that.
But it seems like the coup was. He had no intention of, like, he knew that the coup was going to fail. Like, it was just a part and parcel of the whole spectacle of it, right? But that the point was the suicide. The point was this public ritual disembowelment. I don't think that if everyone in the SDF had been like, yes, all right, let's head, right, I still think he would have probably committed suicide anyway, because it all seems like it was leading up to that moment for him of this grand sacrifice. But then, the question, and how old was he? Because that's like he was younger than we, or certainly younger than I am. I understand.
45, I think he was.
Yeah. So he was a year younger than I am when he took his life.
And you're still hanging around here, Nick.
And I have not written,
Is that why you haven't slit your belly open yet?
Yes, yeah. I've got about 19 novels to write and 18 plays, and but I'll say, before we get to the book, and we should get to the book because the book is excellent. That surprised me a little bit. I didn't expect to enjoy the book as much as I did for a bunch of reasons. Partly because, in a way, I did have that reductionist idea in my mind about him being a neo-fascist, although, as I said, an interesting, multifaceted neo-fascist.
I suppose because he has that part of him, it's if you haven't read him before necessarily, you're kind of reluctant, like, I hope he's not good, because then I,
yes,
I suppose a little bit like, because you're also a big fan of Celine, right?
Yes, and Newt Hampson as well, and they're all highly problematic.
But I'm guessing with those guys, you kind of appreciated them before you knew more about them, right? So then
they were
like, oh, I'm already a fan now. So yeah. So whereas this, you had a chance to head it off at the pass, like, no, and then you, oh damn, this fucker's good. This is annoying. Add another fascist to my reading list.
Yeah, and in his case, it's interesting because he is the basis, for, in many ways, those black truck driving, neo-fascists that drive around. I mean, basically, they said like he reinvigorated that whole kind of movement in Japan, and that to some degree, although it's interesting, they said he introduced an element of anti-Americanism that wasn't there before.
Right.
That
even though I'm sure a whole bunch of those knuckleheads would never consider
read Spring Snow.
Or if they did, they would be horrified. Not so much by Spring Snow, but some of his other stuff. They would be horrified, I think, by other sides of his personality. Or
but then this, less... I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole too. But it fascinates me how a person can, and I get this. We're all, like, as people, we're all multifaceted. We all have those different elements to our personality. You identify at different times, different parts of who you are, like whether it's your ethnicity or your upbringing or who your parents are, or your class, or your politics. But like Mishima, have you ever heard of GASH? Gay Aryan Skinheads?
Oh no, they sound like a lot of fun though.
Yeah, So like they were a group. I don't know I think they started in England maybe, who basically were kind of like frustrated because they were proper, right-thinking racists, but weren't accepted by the overall, Nazi skinhead community because they were gay. So rather than come to the realization that maybe if these people don't like us because of who we are, maybe some of their other ideas are wrong too, they instead formed their own GASH, Gay Aryan Skinheads, so that they could continue to be racists, but in a more supportive, queer-friendly atmosphere. And this,
it's a broad church, isn't it?
Yeah. This is a fascinating thing to me. It's like Women Against Women's Rights, or there's been like, which was an actual organization in the States,
right?
Where people identify with a large group that vilifies them. Right. And so, and that way, Mishima is an interesting figure in that, I mean, my understanding is, generally speaking, people who tend to fall on the far right are not hugely LGBTQ plus friendly.
But then again, I suppose there's a slight, I think we are slightly viewing this through the wrong lens. I think historically there's been a lot more, homosexuality has been less problematic in Japan historically. So I think
and then there's the whole Spartans, thing as well. That idea of militarism, and manly brotherhood, and maybe beyond brotherhood, right?
Yeah. So there's more of a it's a bit of a post-war GHQ conceit that's kind of been slapped on Japan, right? That I'm not, it's nowadays it's kind of weirdly somewhere in between, where it's more, you don't have that much in the way of like gay parades and stuff like that. They do happen, but that's more, I think, to do with just in general here, people don't like to bother other people with their problems, kind of thing, or so it's not necessarily,
yes.
It's not necessarily. I would if I had to guess, I don't know how you would gauge this or how you would measure it, but I'd say the general level of homophobia here is probably lower than it is in a lot of other places. Like, I think a lot of people just don't care about that. It's not really an option, but they wouldn't necessarily
march in a parade
talk
with
about it in a supermarket
flags
with
and
their
stuff. Yeah.
friends. Or, yeah,
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we're straying
from the book
as we've never strayed before.
No.
So Spring Snow, from originally serialized apparently from 1965 to 1967, and then as a book it came out as part of this as part of this quartet in 1969. And shall I take a brief run at the?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't take notes, so I'm not going to remember necessarily characters' names and stuff like that. If I need to, I've got the wiki page open here.
Okay.
But basically, it's a lot of different things, as we'll get into. But basically, it's a coming of age story, isn't it, about a young aristocrat, and this is in the Taisho era, right? This is like the 20s, I guess.
Kind of late Meiji restoration.
It's a lot of referencing back to his Meiji ancestors and the Russo-Japanese War and stuff like that. But very early 20th century Japan, and it's a young aristocrat student coming to terms with the fact that he's falling in love with the daughter of a marquis, right? And yes, there's some weird noise in the background. I don't know what that is, listeners.
Oh, that could be my fridge. It could be possibly.
Okay.
Just ignore it.
Okay. And actually, if you're just boiling it down to that is kind of it, really, isn't it? It's a love story and a coming of age story, kind of entwined, but a lot of stuff happens along the way, and there's a lot of I wouldn't call them twists exactly, that doesn't quite sit right, but the Marquis's daughter, the way her story plays out, I was genuinely quite surprised.
Yes.
I was like, I didn't expect that at all.
I saw things developing in other ways as well, and I ultimately thought like that our Kiyoaki, I think, is our lead character. Yes. I guess I thought that his end would be in a way more spectacular because of who Mishima is and because of the proximity of this book to his own suicide and so on. I kind of felt like, this is where we're going. We're going to some grand gesture, and instead, in a way, the book really isn't melodramatic in a strange way. You know, it's quite and I think the psychology of really all of the lead characters, it's very well drawn. It's very nuanced, you know. Yes. In fact, Kiyoaki's whole development of this weird resentment towards, I don't remember her name now. Do you remember her name?
Was it Shakoto? Satoko,
yeah. His kind of love-hate relationship with her, almost, right? This kind of feeling of like, because he's been raised in part in her household. Right. His family is wealthier than hers, but less classy, less from that old. Yeah. You know, his parents are a little bit more nouveau riche and a bit more kind of crass, and they kind of they fill their house with Western stuff. I mean, you definitely see Mishima's discomfort with the Westernization of Japan, you know. Right.
Even though two of the characters are princes from Thailand, from Siam, right? And they've specifically come there because they're worried that Siam is getting too westernized, and they want to learn more about Asia from staying in Japan, which is something that made my head spin a little bit, because I would have assumed the other way around, but that's probably more to do with my ignorance of early 20th century history in the Greater Asia region.
Although in a way that they're presented as more authentically Asian in the book. The book almost seems to place them in a way of kind of looking with a certain, not judgment, but like there's a great moment in it, like when they're down in Kamakura, and they're kind of hiking up through the woods there, and they come up upon a place where you can see the Kamakura Daibutsu, which is if you haven't been to Kamakura or you didn't work there for a year of your life, like I did, is a gigantic Buddha statue, right? And so they come up and suddenly Buddha just appears, and the two boys from Thailand immediately drop to their knees, like instantaneously, and the two Japanese boys kind of look at them like, whoa, like what's that about?
Yeah, they're a lot more jaded, aren't they?
But recognize in a way that maybe that is there's a part of the book that seems almost judging them for their lack of devotion.
Yeah. Well, it's clearly Mishima is wrestling through his characters here with what it means to be, well, Japanese, what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Buddhist, in opposition to all these other all these other forms of modernization that take over influences. Yeah. But what surprised me most about the book, I think, was also, I mean, obviously we read this in English translation, but if it's an accurate translation, which I think it might be, his prose is like crystal clear.
Oh, yeah.
Like really some amazing imagery is cooked up in the simplest of, it's not a fussily written book. Oh, it's like cut glass or something. But and some throwaway things are like, wow, that's
I bookmarked dozens of pages because the writing was just so beautiful, and as you said, so clear. And there's that Japanese thing, and you don't want to make broad generalizations, but it is a thing that.
But you're going to anyway.
But I'm going to, So let me do it now. Something that is done extremely well by some Japanese writers and artists is that ability to capture a moment in time and a moment in nature, right? And to make it resound in this really beautiful way. And this idea of the transitory nature of life, which again shows up over and over again in haiku and in no plays, and this is something that he seems to really get, this ability to sketch this little moment, whether it's just the sunlight dappling through something or whether it's the way the snow is drifted or whatever. But every time he does it, it's just you almost swoon. And what I love about this book is when I was reading about it, and I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Because I was about halfway through and I thought to myself, this feels almost like like our lead character is beautiful, right? They come back over and over again, that our lead male character, and they're both very beautiful people, right? But really our narrator, whoever they are, our omniscient narrator, really stresses how attractive Kiyoaki is, like this almost translucent skin and these big doe eyes and stuff. And I was like, this is written like the way that like 17 and 18-year-old Japanese boys are sometimes presented nowadays in Japan in these kind of idoru magazines aimed at middle-aged women, right? Like it had this element of like or
shonen ai manga, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then did you read that like it famously was adapted to manga form by the woman who did Rose of Versailles. Right. And as soon as I read that, I was like, of course it was. Because it did in some ways read like a beautifully written, nuanced, psychologically like deep comic about beautiful boys.
Beautiful boys in pain.
Yeah.
So it's it makes perfect sense. I like to see beautiful girls in pain, but it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing, basically.
Okay.
but the other thing I appreciated about it as well, like you said, it slightly wrong-footed me because it's coming from Mishima, you think it's going a certain way. But then what I appreciated was how the Satoko side of the story, she was giving a lot more. Like at first, I think you thought, okay, this is going to be more or less Kyoki's story, and not necessarily that he's going to come out of this positively or negatively, but regardless, it's going to be about how his
journey
and how, and you know, like how his cruelty or his naivety or his lack of it, and it's all going to be how it affected him, and then it's going to be him kind of looking back, and then I remember the dirt. If only I'd, but at a certain point you realize, oh no, she's a lot more complicit and mixed up in this story.
Oh, yeah.
Than how it was. So it's not about him specifically. It's not, and then all the other characters as well. They have their kind of briefly, but they have their kind of moment in the spotlight as well, right? And it's a remarkable. And to your point, again, I mean, maybe you might want to mention this because you mentioned it before when I spoke to you off air before we started talking about. You were saying that I was surprised because this book has a lot of elements that would normally rub you the wrong way, and I'd like you to get into that because I was wondering. I can guess some of them, but from my point of view as well, the other thing is, it's one of the reasons I like finding a writer that you really enjoy, that who writes widely, is that it gives you a chance to read things that you wouldn't normally read, because I tend to maybe read generically in a way. I tend to think, oh yes, I like this type of book, but I don't necessarily, I'm not interested in that type of book. And if this wasn't the Mishima book and someone said, oh, you should read this, give me a book, and they just, yeah, it's a coming of age, love story, I'd be like, no, you take that right back. I'm off to read my crime novels or my best of Dan Dare compilation or whatever it is, right? That's just not for me. But because I'm fascinated by Mishima, I'll read anything by him. And that means I end up reading this kind of story. And it's not just that it's good nutrition or whatever. I mean, I genuinely really enjoyed this book, start to finish. It was quite the paper.
I read it quite quickly. I was surprised, in like lengthy bouts of sitting and getting completely absorbed in the story, and that I thought it was going to be a bit of a slog. I think
I won't be mentioning that at my next, lumberjacks meeting of manly men, but just between you and me, Nick. I really got into it.
So I suppose the things that would have, I mean, we already talked about it, but the neo-fascist, as I said, thing, right? A very reductive way of looking at Mishima, but you can't not deal with it, right? It's there, and it's there in this book,
yes,
for
it
sure.
is, yeah.
So there's that, and actually, this is a side thought.
Just because I think the viewer might have missed this. When you say that's one thing, you're listing the things you might have had a problem with, right?
Issues, yeah. So maybe I will go through those, and then just remind me to come back to what was his name? Iki Kita, I think. I'll have to look it up anyway. But there's a famous kind of I guess proto-fascist figure in Japanese history who kind of anyway. But so there's that, and then there's the fact that this is a story about a bunch of rich people.
Right, yes.
Which immediately for me tends to be the kind of thing, and in this case, kind of rich schoolboys and their rich schoolboy problems.
Right, right.
And then what you've already said, I mean, generally I don't tend to gravitate towards doomed romance stories, or at least I haven't since I was a teenager. But that's what struck me. This is one of the things that I loved about the book, was that he had this like Jim Steinman-esque way of seizing upon that, and if you don't know who I know you know who Jim Steinman is, but if the listeners don't, Jim Steinman wrote all of Meatloaf's songs, and what's that one by Bonnie Tyler?
Keep on going, you're fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Total Eclipse of the Heart. That ability to seize upon, like, when are people, generally speaking, at their most psychopathic, the most out of control, where their emotions are the most kind of unhinged, when not getting the girl is a matter of life and death, where the idea of spending a week apart is like crawling across ground glass with your ball sack, hanging open. like there's like there's an intensity about being 16, 17 years old and being in love that is just off the charts crazy. And then, later in life, you kind of settle into something more manageable, right?
Right.
But I love that stuff, and I love artists who attempt to continue that, to kind of explore that ridiculous over the topness. And so I do feel like this book does a great job of like the moment where they're sitting in the kind of little jinrickshaw being pulled, and he's like trying, like he's so close to her, but he can't quite touch her hand, or her leg is like the intensity of those moments took me right back to being 16, 17,
Agreed.
And then him, like basically him losing his virginity, all of that stuff is just so amped up in a really exciting and wonderful way.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that happening to me. I can't wait. It sounds really good.
Someday, class. But it, in a weird way, it reminded me also. And the funny thing is, a part of me kept expecting at some point one of these two lead, because there is a second male character, right? Our protagonist's kind of best friend from school, right? And they have a strange relationship as well. And he's going to be a lawyer.
It's interesting. I was wondering throughout the whole, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one person. It could be all of them, which is probably more to the point. But while I was reading it, I was flipping between Kyoaki or Honda for which one is the Mishima surrogate.
Yeah, and I think they both are.
Hang on, but it's basically everyone.
I think they are.
Yeah,
both. Yeah. So a part of me kept wondering, like, when's one of them gonna go fully fascist? Like, I just assume it's some part of my brain. I just assumed that, like,
well, one character did, if you remember. It was his houseboy.
Yes.
He did end up, and surprisingly, it wasn't written very sympathetically either.
No,
like, he was almost so. That's the other fascinating thing about Mishima as well is all of this stuff plus his self-awareness of it all as well. Like, even you would imagine he'd be the first one to step up and point out when he was being ridiculous, if you see what I mean. Like, but also at the same time, the first one to put on the stoic face and almost refuse to realize the element of ridiculousness in the situation if it wasn't, apt to do so at that time. Or
so what I was going to say, it reminded me a little bit of this combination of like the time period and the intense sexual emotion, and then this thread, although in the book it's less obvious, this thread of maybe emergent neo-fascism, is Suzuki Seijun's Fighting Elegy.
Which I've not seen, actually, I don't think.
What?
No.
Clive.
Right, I'm writing it
Wait,
down. I have a copy, I've just never got around to it. I think it's because it's one of those whole bunch of films I haven't seen. So nothing's ever made it stand, like, to me, it's one of...
Okay.
Well, there's a whole bunch of Seijun Suzuki films I haven't seen.
No
one's ever pointed it out to me until now.
Then,
so,
yeah, okay, all right. So, I won't say any more about it then. Just watch that and then see. And now it's been a while since I saw it, but there was an element in there where it kind of, okay, I won't say any more. Just give it a go. And I think if you're somebody who decides to read this book based on the conversation we're having right now, then maybe also see that movie as well, because it's another angle on a similar kind of time, I guess, and a similar kind of personality.
Right.
But yeah, no, I mean, it was fantastic. What can I say? The book kicked ass. It was, and also for me there was an element of nostalgia, because there are quite a lot of descriptions of Yukigahama Beach down in Kamakura, and I worked in Kamakura for a year, and in fact I ended up in the head priest of the big Shinto temple that's down there. I ended up in his house because I taught his wife English at a little English school down there, and she invited me over to the house for, like, with a bunch of the other afternoon ladies that were in her lesson, and that was quite a, that experience you have in Japan when you are, and this is the kind of thing that rightfully annoys Japanese people, particularly neo-fascists, that as a gaijin in Japan, you sometimes have doors open to you that a Japanese person is never going to have open for them, right? One of them is something like that, right? I'm sitting cross-legged on a tatami floor in this absolutely ornate, beautiful, and basically, if you're the head priest of Kamakura Jinja, you're like the number 2 head priest in Japan. I think only Hachiman is kind of higher in terms of that the hierarchy of those things, and his son was like the number 2 or number 3 priest there. So their family was basically in that tiny circle of people who end up head priests of the major. But I ended up backstage at Kabuki, watching one of the Kabuki actors put on their makeup and stuff. Again, I had and I can remember students of mine who are Japanophile Japanese just be like disgusted.
Yes, you would have not appreciated it really
at all.
No,
not with a degree of nuance that they would have.
No.
Sure.
But that's why they wouldn't get in, right? And
exactly.
And as long as you're prepared to play the
bumbling gaijin.
Yeah, the pet to get it in for the day, then you can go some interesting places. I think everyone, all foreigners who spent some time have had this experience. Like, why am I here? Like,
my wife met one of their imperial family, right?
There we go.
And so, but I will say, this is another thing. I wondered if at all there was any. Mishima himself was briefly involved with Princess Michiko before she married the emperor,
right?
Which is interesting, given that there is an imperial connection and an imperial marriage kind of planned in the book, right?
Right.
And this is entirely not connected to anything, but Mishima was a big fan of a few things that make me more sympathetic to him. Like, he was a big Godzilla fan, a big fan of Ultraman, a big fan of manga generally speaking, and some specific manga that are particularly, like, there was a comedy one that I remember thinking like, oh, that's an interesting choice.
Well, a few of them we may get to, right, on our other
in fact, one of the right here, I bought this because this was apparently one of, well, not necessarily this specific volume, but this Hiroshi Hirata was apparently a favorite mangaka of Mishima.
Right.
So this is Bloody Stumps the Samurai, which we may do.
He's one of the Gekiga, original Gekiga guys, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other thing as well, is I read this book through and enjoyed it for what it is, but then glancing at the Wikipedia page, I've realized it's also a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of all of things it references, because there's a lot of stuff about bodhisattvas and Buddhism and all that stuff, and you guaranteed that stuff isn't just thrown in there willy-nilly or I mean Mishima was a huge student of all sorts of things. He it very much was a polymath, right? So that's another point of interest for me as well, that it's a way into some of that stuff as well, because a lot of that stuff can just be like a wall of like where to start. Like, I don't get, it looks pretty and I like the sounds of the pealing bells and it's nice and all that is evocative, but I have no idea why that elephant is there, or whatever. So this is quite a good kind of starting point for that kind of stuff as well. So I certainly will be reading the rest of this quartet of books as well, I think so too.
I don't know that I'll do it right away. I don't know that I want to binge them. I might do it in a year. I quite happily come back every year, maybe at Christmas time, as a little Christmas gift to myself, and read the next one over the next few years.
Right. Yes. Mishima Claus.
Yes.
Another treat in his sack.
Yes, indeed. And sorry, the last things, have you seen the Yakuza movie he made quite a bit earlier on? Like, I think around 1960. It's the like, I'm Afraid to Die or Afraid to Die or something like that.
No. I've put that on my list actually, since I've become a fan of it. And yes, I was reminded of it. And I was like, I should probably definitely watch that, because he's the lead in it as well.
He's the lead actor, yeah, and he sings the theme song.
Right, which is fascinating. So he's like a very early, you know, in terms of nowadays, you know, you have talento, right, who do the singing, they star in the film, and you know, they do all the TV commercials and stuff. So it's interesting that Mishima might have kind of gone that route as well.
Well, you know,
kind of pretty boy.
On his Facebook entry, they mentioned I mean, I don't know if it's how well sourced it is, but he was one of the first, or if not the first, people that the Japanese media labeled as a superstar.
Right. And yes, of course, he has been in a whole bunch of films, and his whole thing around Kurotokage, the Black Lizard, and the female impersonator stuff as well. And yeah, like we said,
what was her name? Is it Miwa Akihito or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. She still appeared. I mean, at least when I was living, okay, it's 10 years ago, but she was still on TV all the time in Japan.
Yeah.
A decade ago.
So yeah, I mean, to enter Mishima world is a fascinating entry point for all sorts of things, I think. But I think what Spring Snow reminded me of as well is entirely divorced from all that. Like, you don't need to know all that. It just reads as
that's a great book.
Yeah.
A fantastic book. Yeah.
So
yes. I would strongly recommend it to anyone who has an interest. I would say this would be a great entry point into Mishima. If what you're saying is that some of the nonfiction may be a bit more impenetrable, this is compulsively readable.
Yes.
Yeah.
I suppose the other novel of his that I read that I thoroughly enjoyed, which I would recommend to you, Nick, and would after this maybe, is Temple of the Golden Pavilion.
Okay.
The true story of the guy who burned down the ancient temple in Kyoto.
Yeah.
That's again shares a lot in common with this book, but is also quite different. But certainly again has that cut glass prose, which is just a pleasure to read. Anyway, I guess that's us for this time.
Yep.
So until next time on Literary as Feck, we're just off to ritualistically disembowel ourselves.
Yep.
So
got a pen right here.
Not until next time. That's it. It's done.
No, that was it. We were so moved.
Bye.